I left and I was playing golf. And when we got there, it was my boss is still rolling that car. I had to finish it. I was like, play 18. You can tell they both got all red in the face. They didn't drink it. No, we were going to time to 9 at the CLA. I was just like, it's Jeff's fault. As I was walking out, Jeff, she takes this look inside.
Yeah, you guys.
All right, good morning. Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Indiana Journal of Law and Social Equality Symposium, the link between sports and social equality. My name is Ann McFadden, and I'm the Assistant Dean for Career Services. As you may have surmised, I am not an athlete. Sports is so much a part of our day-to-day lives. It brings us together as spectators and as participants. It has the power to bridge the many gaps between us. We use the language of sports in all contexts. We keep our eyes on the prize, we clear a hurdle, we huddle up for important discussions, we run out the clock, we go the distance, and we throw a Hail Mary as a last hopeful effort. And we use the language of sports when we talk about social equality. We want a level playing field for all. We talk about those born with privilege getting a head start in the race of life, or even being born on third base and thinking they hit a triple. Turns of phrase aside, it makes sense to discuss sports in the context of social equality, because sports truly have the ability to unify disparate groups, impart opportunities, and help us achieve the goal of social equality. Participation in sports builds skills and teaches lessons that participants can carry on to other facets of life, accepting coaching with grace and humility, learning to work as a team towards a common goal, putting in the effort to advance one's individual abilities and to maximize one's natural talents. And the wonderful thing about sports is that everyone can achieve these benefits, no matter where they come from or who they are. That is, if there are no barriers, legal, social, or otherwise, to stand in the way. Historically, sports was not the unifier and equalizer that we think of now. Sports teams were segregated. Opportunities for women were limited. But because of changes in the law, people of all walks of life can enjoy the benefits of sports, and as a result, social equality has been enhanced. Although sports have come a long way, there's room for more equality in sports. There is room for more opportunity in sports. And there's room for the law to advance, to protect and promote that equality and those opportunities. Today's symposium will touch on a number of areas, which we will explore with the help of our panels of experts in the fields of law and sports. First, we will talk about building a social movement one sport at a time. Like sports is reflected in our language, issues that arise in sports reflect issues in broader society. From the intersection of the civil rights movement and the 1968 Mexico Olympics to the intersection of the Me Too movement and the USA Gymnastics scandal. It's a chicken or egg question. Do sports create these moments, or do sports reflect these moments? Second, we'll move to collusion or competition, the NCAA and its relationship with antitrust law. There are few areas of law more intertwined with sports than antitrust. Believe me, I worked in the antitrust division for 11 years before coming here, so I know this. It's a complicated relationship and is a complicated area of law, and we're going to explore that connection. Third, we're going to learn about the cost of kneeling. Professional athletes are well paid and they gain fame and a public platform, but this is not without cost, both physical and personal. What do teams owe athletes that endure physical injury with lifelong effects? Should athletes have to risk their reputations and potentially their jobs when they make a potentially polarizing statement? Should they be forced to just shut up and play and stay silent? And then lastly, we will talk about a woman's worth, the disparity in pay and representation. Title IX has brought much greater equality in women's and men's sports, but once our athletes graduate, disparity in pay is considerable. We'll explore the hurdles that face female athletes and the question of disparity in pay and representation. Why does it exist and why it is a problem? We want to thank you for being here and to thank our incredible group of panelists from across industry, government, academia, and legal practice for making the time to share their expertise. We hope that you enjoy the day.
All right, as Dean McFadden mentioned, our first panel will be building a social movement one sport at a time. As I call the panelists' names, if you'd like to come up and take your seat, that would be great. First, we have Amy Dillard, who joined the Maurer School of Law this year as a visiting professor. She currently teaches legal professions for the 1L class. Prior to Indiana University, she served as a tenured professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law and American University Washington College of Law. Her focus is on criminal law. However, in the past years, she has taught race, crime, and media, and Professor Dillard has followed the Green Bay Packers ever since her college roommate showed her a Bart Starr autograph ball from Super Bowl I. Our second panelist is Susan Shan. She's an attorney for Neitlinger Gray in Indianapolis. She focuses her practice now on commercial litigation and products liability. She earned her JD from the University of Georgia School of Law, where she served as an editor for the Georgia Journal of International and Comparative Law. After a successful mock trial career, she decided to become a sports writer for a little while before practicing law. Now she is an avid sports fan and roots for the Texas A&M Aggies, the Kentucky Wildcats, the Steelers, and the St. Louis Cardinals. Our third panelist is Angie Terrain. She graduated from DePaul University, where she was a basketball and track and field student athlete. She's also a Maurer alum and served as an adjunct professor of sports law at Northern Illinois University. Currently, she's at Notre Dame and oversees the men's tennis program. She also serves as an associate athletics director for human resources and legal and risk management. And our final panelist is Lawrence Ware, who's the co-director of the at Oklahoma State University, the co-director of the Africana Studies program, and teaching assistant professor and diversity coordinator in the Department of Philosophy. Professor Ware is the only teacher of sports, race, and philosophy at Oklahoma State. Professor Ware roots for the Pittsburgh Steelers and LeBron James. Kind of a rough time right now. And then finally, our moderator is Ben Adams.
Well, thank you all and good morning. I'm going to skip any introductory remarks and just get right to it because I think we have a lot to cover. As Dean McFadden mentioned, we all experience sports from different perspectives. Some of us are primarily spectators, while some of us are participants. And by way of introduction, I was hoping that we could hear from each of our panelists a little bit about how they view themselves and their own relationship to sports. So if we could start with Ms. Shan, we're wondering sort of, do you experience sports primarily as a spectator, as a participant, what is your general relationship to sports these days?
So I grew up in Texas in my early years, and my dad went to Texas A&M, which is why I'm a huge Aggie fan today. But I grew up as an Aggie kid, and he used to take me to bars to watch A&M football games because we didn't have cable. So football was my first love, but growing up, I played basketball also. And then during the summers, because there's no football and basketball, there was only baseball on TBS. So it was the Astros. So I taught myself the rules of baseball as well. So I think that in terms of sports, it was integrated within me at a very young age.
My turn?
Please.
Gosh, I love sports a great deal. I'm a father, and so my oldest son plays baseball. He's pretty good. He needs to work on his swing. I played baseball in high school, a little bit in college. I played football in high school and middle school, and a little bit in college, but I wasn't that good, so I got kicked off the team. I am an avid baseball, football, basketball fan. I don't like hockey because I don't understand the concept of the sport. But I'm a big fan of sports. I'm a huge fan of sports. I'm both a participant in the fact that I'm a father, and I write about sports as well for the New York Times and other places. But more than anything, I'm more of a fan of sports. So that's kind of where I am.
So as you heard, was an athlete, and was is real big, right? I was on the treadmill this morning, and it reminded me that I was an athlete, not anymore. But my everyday life is sports. So it's truly from the time I wake up in the morning to the time I go to bed at night, that's what my focus is. And on top of that, like Lawrence, I'm a parent who has 3 girls who play volleyball. So one has gone on to college and played, and 2 right behind her that are trying to do the same thing. So I guess I'm a participant from wishing I had the skills and the height that they did and that they do. But it's really integrated in my life on a daily basis.
I think I've evolved on it. I love Kevin Costner baseball movies. I love sports writing. I used to love horse racing until I watched a horse get put down at the Derby. I used to love football. I used to watch the combine every year because I loved watching just the athleticism of it. But I was pretty happy when my 9-year-old son walked in on Super Bowl Sunday and it happened to be on with no sound, and he said, "What sport is this, Mama?" This says a lot about him, too. But I did grow up in the ACC. I grew up the road from Clemson, so I obviously love really good college basketball. I don't like bad college basketball, but I like really good college basketball.
So, keeping all these characterizations in mind and thinking about more broadly how the kinds of roles that you've all described can fit and be mixed and matched with almost any one of us. Has the relationship of our society to sports changed over time? Was there a time when we were more as a group, when we were more focused on being participants, or has spectator sports become more all-encompassing than it used to be? How do we balance that relationship in your views with the modern society and media? And I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this, Ms. Shan.
So I think that for me, growing up, sports was always something that was pure. And it's so, in Jerry Maguire, when he asked Rod Tidwell to go back to that day that he started playing football for love of the game, to me, that was what sports was. And so I think that, as I've grown up and gotten older, and a lot of that popped. Point shaving, because I grew up playing basketball, point shaving was just unheard of to me. It was crazy to even think about it. And so I think that now sports has really evolved for what it holds for me. And when I was a sports writer, it was something that was all-consuming. It was every day, and it was 24/7. Then all your friends want to talk about sports all the time. And so something that I really loved turned into something that I really didn't love. And so it's a big part of the reason why I left, because sports was always an escape for me. It was a way, I think, like any form of entertainment, that you can sort of escape from your real life. And so by having that be your job and having that be your life, it was very difficult. And I didn't have an escape because my outlet became my life. And so I think in terms of how sports has evolved in general, as I've gotten older, I think that the world of sports has also gotten less pure. And so I think it's a lot dirtier now, it's a lot more economical, and it's much less about love of the game and much more about dollars. And not that there's anything wrong with that, because as I've gotten older, I've also sort of lost some of that naivety, and I've become more of a logical, reasonable person, and less emotional. So I think that that's sort of how sports has evolved from when I was younger, but also within me.
Okay, so I'm only going to talk about it from the perspective of being a 37, 38-year-old man. I don't think sports has ever really been pure. I think that it's always been, I think on the lower levels, if you get into the little leagues, the high school, not even high school, if you get into the middle school, then it's pure, right? Then they're playing for the love of the sport and teamwork, all that kind of stuff. Once you start moving into the high school level and you start moving into the elite athletes, that's when the money starts getting involved. College, we can talk about this all day, but college players need to be paid, and that is not at all pure. NBA players, people say bad things about LeBron James because he chose to leave, but he's looking out for himself. That's part of the reason why I love him so much, is because he's looking out for what's best for him. And so if we recognize that sports has never really been pure once you get into the elite levels, then let's just be honest about where we are. So has it evolved? Yeah, I guess the perception of sports has evolved, but sports themselves, I don't think they've evolved very much at all.
Can I say one counter?
Go for it. Go for it.
So
It's gonna be fun.
I think that Hakeem Olajuwon, great player, was one of my idols growing up in Texas. His first contract, he didn't even hire an agent because he didn't want to do that. he actually got one of his friends who was a manager at a gas station to represent him. And so the Rockets really screwed him. They took advantage of him, and I think he played for like $1 million a year.
Yep.
And so when we talk about sports and how it's never been pure, I mean, Rod Tidwell said and Jerry Maguire that he never had that moment where he played for love of the game. It was always about money for him. And so I think that there are some people who are all about the money, but there are people who still we can look at as pure. But the thing is, Hakeem Olajuwon, that was when I was like 12. And so when we look at the NBA now, I can't think of one person who would be the Hakeem of today. I don't even watch the NBA anymore. That's how much I think the NBA, in terms of what it has evolved into, to be less pure.
I'll let you guys get in. Just saying.
Well, and if I could, I mean, because what I'm hearing here actually brings me to a broader point about whether or not we are more influenced by, because what I'm hearing is the influence of the perception of sports, the influence that we all feel as people who are absorbing sports as a viewer, but even as a participant. That even when you're younger and you are finding yourself getting into sports or first really deciding, as you said, Professor Ware, you know, that moment when you switch into the high school sports and all of a sudden the motivations sort of change. Are we generally more influenced by something that we do or something that we watch? Or is there even a way that we can divide that? I mean, Director Terrain, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on as someone who has both, you know, participated and led people in this transition, you know, what your thoughts are on that.
I guess when I think about the purity of it, I think about when I was growing up, when you could be a multi-sport athlete, right? Mm-hmm. This is where I think sport has evolved the most. Right. There are no multi-sport athletes. By the time you turn 2, your parents are putting you in soccer, and that's what you do until, you know, it's this thought process of, I got to get my kid in college. What do I got to do to make sure my kid can get a full scholarship? It's not about, hey, kid, what do you want to play? Why do you want to play, right? It's parents and others, you know, now it go back to the economics of it, right? That's right. Mm-hmm. How do we get this kid to where I, you know, want them to be, as opposed to stepping back and asking, truly, why are they playing, right? And I have to have that conversation with my children, right? And it's because of what they see, right? My youngest is 12. Her oldest sister's 22. She watched her older sister play, so she thinks that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to play volleyball because that's what I've seen, right? And I'm going, how about basketball? How about choir? How about, you know, something else to make you a little bit more well-rounded, you know, student, person? And I don't think those conversations, in my opinion, I could be totally off base, are not happening. And that's making our sports evolve to, like when you said, it gets to high school, it's not about playing for the love of basketball. It's playing for who's in the stands, who's recruiting me, and where can I go.
And they all have their own private coaches now.
And just
all
the
high school
amount
kids
to play club volleyball and club soccer. I mean, the time, not even the money, but the time commitment to that. And how often do they ask, how are your grades today? Right?
Rarely.
Yeah.
So,
if at all.
So that's where I think sports has begun to evolve. Now again, a lot of opportunities for women, students, that's amazing. So it's good, but it's still trying to find that balance.
You know, I was thinking about the intersection of, so my children are little, they're just 6 and 9, notwithstanding how old I am. I think a lot about how play and exercise and sports interact, and how much that has changed since I was a kid. And, you know, once upon a time, you could be a multi-sport athlete and you could play, right? You might not be a starter on the basketball team, but if you wanted to play, you probably could make the team if you had, you know, some athletic ability and were reasonably fit. And you could do that, and it was playful. And it was fun. And I feel like in watching sports, I don't see those things come together so much. And I mean, when you do see it come together, and I was talking last night, you know, when you when you watch somebody like Zion Williams fly through the air to block a shot from the corner, you can see the play and the athleticism and the fitness all at once in it. And God, if that could just keep going, like, wouldn't it be fun to watch somebody do that as a professional athlete and to keep having that sort of joy in doing it? But I think that's what's lost, or at least it's what I see lost when I see children moving into sports as being their dominant activity. And of course, it also takes up all the time that, the 4 hours they're supposed to just spend outdoors or in the woods or doing nothing, or it takes up that time. And so it's a substitution. And if it's not play, then there's bound to be a trade-off there, something that's lost.
Well, and we've heard a few allusions here to the dynamics in youth sports, and I know we didn't necessarily talk about this in advance, but the dynamics in youth sports and the disparities that exist with elite youth athletes, and to sort of touch on this divide, this class divide that we have between parents who are able to devote that kind of time to their kids' development versus parents who aren't, and what that means for young athletes, aspiring professional athletes. What do we see in society that is providing for people who want that opportunity, who don't necessarily have that support system around them that can drive them 4 hours to a game, or that can pay the fees for the club soccer and the club volleyball? What sorts of institutions are there to support people in those situations?
I mean, I don't think there are very many institutions. I mean, so when you get into the elite athletes, so for example, my son is 10 years old, and he's a pretty good baseball player, but he has a private coach already. Mm-hmm. And that's because he is halfway decent. If he wasn't very good, I wouldn't spend the money to do it. But it comes out of your pocket. Right. Now, if you are a parent who played baseball or who played basketball like LeVar Ball, then you're out there drilling your kids. Right. Early in the morning before they go to school, then they come back and you're drilling them again. There are no institutions, but what happens is you have this group of people who are not the elite athletes, and they're playing for the love of the game, they're having fun, and they're building relationships or whatever. And then you have these elite athletes who are working essentially for the future, for money, right? And so what that creates is this divide between these elite athletes who are working for the sake of money, working to kind of trying to get into the league, whatever, and then you have everyone else, and it creates this kind of inherent divide between the have and have-nots inside of athletic sports.
I think too, Ben, it helps to think about the sports that are simply never going to be within reach, right? Tennis, golf, dressage, right?
Yeah.
Just never. Exactly. But if you're standing in Paris and you're watching a dressage competition, you're seeing the high dollar prize on that. Or you're watching that in the Olympics, right? You're watching horse racing events, you're watching the equestrian events in the Olympics. You come away going, oh, there are people who just don't even, and I barely know, right? But I've watched these things, and you realize how out of reach that is. And we think about sports and just simple things like the equipment that it costs to be able to engage.
The equipment to play golf, the equipment to play tennis is so expensive.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you add access to it, and then you add that it's a private individual sport, and so there won't be a club version of it, and you won't be able to shift from soccer to frisbee and other things that are playful. It really is. It's a lifetime sport, and if you didn't have access to it because you inherited access to it, and Richard Williams isn't your father, then you're probably not going to get there.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I think about how it affects the high school level. So in the inner cities, right? So those who they can get a basketball team together, cannot get a volleyball team together, right? So, and that's the point of the parents not having the time or the money to be able to commit to that type of time and financial commitment. So there are, that only affects this kid if they want to go to, professional, but it affects the schools as well when they're trying to keep play and athletics and things like that in the system.
Well, and I guess having touched on the access question, the sort of next stage in this discussion would be what happens once you have that access, right? And so this will take us sort of to a talk about the modern athlete and the way the modern athlete can influence our social movements. And I'm wondering if we could begin, Professor Dillard, with this talk. Dean McFadden mentioned the involvement of the Me Too movement in sports, and I'm wondering if we could begin with a little bit of discussion about the role of the Me Too movement in some of the gymnastics scandals and other ways in which it is manifested in sports, since we've seen so much of it discussed in media and entertainment spaces so far.
Yeah, so I mean, the one that has had the most publicity since, I guess I would say since November of 17, when the Weinstein story broke, is going to be USA Gymnastics. And watching Allie Reisman read her letter, if you haven't done it, you just should do it. If you want to see how a machine can chew up a person, and chew up a person not just because of the sexual abuse, but the physical abuse and the devotion to sport, and how one person can ruin the thing that was her whole life. Mm-hmm. It's just astonishing to see the parallels between, Brock Turner's victim and her letter and Allie Reisman's, even though they had very different experiences. They're both sexually assaulted, but they both write about this loss of self and about this loss of life and the way they saw themselves in the world. And there are 250 Allie Reismans in that one story alone, right? I mean, that is one story, 250 girls, all traced back to one doctor, but also traced back to USA Gymnastics that, made it possible for 30 years for that to happen. I think that it obviously brings some attention to the role of coach to athletes, particularly in individual sports, where you spend a lot of time with the private coach, and what the power that person has over children. But I have to say, when I was thinking about this last night, I was reminded that while Allie Reisman and the USA Gymnastics women all fit under our hashtag of Me Too because of timing, we don't put the boys who, suffered at Jerry Sandusky's hands under that same umbrella. And it's the same story.
That's a good point.
It's the same story. It's just timed a little different. I mean, it's timed differently. And it's, and of course, there's boys and not girls. And we've had that conversation, I think, is starting to bubble, certainly in Hollywood, is starting to bubble. But I think the story is maybe less about Me Too has made it possible to say these things, which I think, those two certainly are connected. But this is pre-existing relationship, whether we label it as sexual abuse like Sandusky and Nassar, or whether we broaden it a little into what the physical, mental, emotional abuse can look like. I think that is sort of that's what's become interesting to me the more that I look at it. And I think about, you saying that your son has the private baseball coach, and what that means. You're handing a child a very personal, meaningful relationship, one that he's going to remember whether he plays baseball or not his whole life. Like, you spend a lot of time with this person and talk about how his elbow is bent or straight, or his the bodiness of it, the embodiedness of the relationship, I think is vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what anyone else has to say in reaction to that as well. But
She said it
well,
well.
and I think some of what we did hear there was about the relationship of these coaches to young people, and thinking about how a lot of this came out of Michigan State University. I was wondering, Director Terrain, if we could talk a little bit about the college athlete, and we've seen just in the last few days what happened at Ole Miss, where we had a number of basketball players kneeling on the court to protest a pro-Confederate rally, and is there some way in which the college athlete, as opposed to the professional athlete, is restrained in their ability to I mean, we're going to talk a little later on another panel about the professional athlete and the costs of their protests. But in terms of the college athlete, what is any constraint that's placed on a college athlete, or is there more liberation at an athlete at a public institution versus a private institution? What do you think about?
And again, the opinions that are coming are my opinions and not of the University of Notre Dame. I just want to make sure I state that. But you know what? I really believe that it depends on the institution, right? And the leaders of the institution. If you have an institution that is open to trying to educate the student athlete and saying, okay, you want to do this. All right, one, why? Let's talk about this. Are you really, in your heart, in your system, know exactly what you're fighting for? Two, where your teammates stand, right? Are they behind you? Are they not? How can you guys get somewhere in a medium, in a happy medium to keep what's going on, keep your team productive and winning? And three, let's talk about what the repercussions of this, right? What's going to happen if you kneel? And are you ready for that? I don't think the university stance should be to stop it, but to educate and help. Now, the unintentional subjugation for of this is that the student athlete is thinking, oh my God, what is my coach going to say? Will I lose my scholarship? Will my playing time go away if I do this? Will the community shun me if I do this? Things that a normal student don't really have to think about as much, right? Even though the university may say you have the right to protest and do, whatnot, as long as you follow, whatever rules and don't disrupt or whatever, but there's still just a little bit more at cost for a student athlete, I feel. And then there are some institutions that just say, we're not kneeling during the national anthem, or we're not doing this. And so it really depends on the university, its leadership. And now, I think the question was, are they listened to? And maybe they are. Maybe they are listened to. Hopefully they're given the opportunity to express their views. It may not come to the outcome that they want, right? But at least they have the opportunity to dialogue and discuss how they're feeling and why they're feeling the way that they do. But I really do think it depends on the institution and the leadership.
Well, and given the fact that we have seen sort of a resurgence in student activism sort of more broadly in the United States, I'm wondering if there's already a platform for a student athlete that maybe some other activist group on a campus doesn't necessarily have. And you mentioned the ability of the student athlete to go to a coach or to an administrator and say, here's what I'm thinking about. Is that a difference between what other students have on a campus, that access?
I would say yes, because if you choose to do it during a competition and it's a televised competition, you already have a platform of people that are seeing what you're doing, whether students who are just protesting on campus. Maybe the local news pick it up, maybe the local news does not. But anything that's happening in the athletics department that a student athlete is doing, it's going to make it somewhere in the news, on TV, or unless you're really, really small, hidden school.
I mean, let's just be honest about the difference between a student athlete and like a student. I mean, a student athlete is a person who has a platform no matter what. A student, I mean, we could kneel right now. We can play the national anthem. We all kneel and no one would care. Right. But if do you have a football team?
We do have a football team here at IU. We do have a football team.
But if the football team, I didn't know if they did or not. I think got a basketball team. But if the basketball team were to kneel, it'd be national news, right? So there's just a difference between student athletes and athletes. Yeah. Student athletes and students, excuse me.
Well, and that sort of brings us to a broader discussion about the media. Because I think this platform question and the media and the way in which the media covers these things And Ms. Shan, with your prior experience as a sports journalist, and having left that and able to reflect on it from an external point of view now, I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on the diversity of perspectives in the coverage. Is there any way in which the makeup of the sports media environment informs the way these things are covered? And does the identity of those people who cover sports matter in terms of the way these issues are addressed?
Yeah, so I think that it sort of goes along with the theme that we've been talking about today, which is the evolution of sports. And, when I was a sports writer, I was in New York City, and, I was always very, very careful about what I said. I mean, I screened my social media very carefully. And I think that there is, even though I'm a minority, there is a difference between someone who's Asian and someone who is African American, because, with the African American community, I think that you have Black Lives Matter, you have, something that with the history with this country that Asians just don't share. And so, Jamil Hill, we had met in New York, and she's a great person. Worked at ESPN with Michael Smith, and they hosted, a show on basically Sports Center at 6 o'clock, and she's done some other stuff. And so Jamil, obviously she's African American. She's very passionate about these social topics, and so, she got in trouble in 2017 when she had tweeted about Trump, and she had also made a tweet about Jerry Jones. And so those two things basically got her suspended. So she got suspended for 2 weeks, and then she got reinstated, but then got reassigned and basically pulled off the television media and put on as a writer on social and racial sports intersection topics. Eventually she left. She's at The Atlantic now. But I think that, I think it's very interesting, I think, also with ESPN and how that has evolved, because I think a lot of people now, they joke about ESPN like it has a liberal bias or whatnot, and that ESPN has turned from a pure sports channel into something where they really care about social commentary. And it's very interesting. And I think that you guys will, have a lot to say on this. Lawrence, I'm interested to hear what you think about the media. But, I think for me personally, and it's really just because I feel like sports for me is one type of thing. And so I think that even though there is a platform, and if you're a journalist, you are in the public eye, and so it's your platform. I just feel like, me personally, I would rather have sports just be sports, because I remember when ESPN was a 24-hour news highlight show, and I loved that. I mean, I could not get enough of it. And now I can't even watch ESPN anymore because it's all about debates and topics, and I feel like the sports has really gotten away from that. And it's very interesting, I think, how that has really evolved within the past 10 years.
What do you mean by sports just being sports? What do you mean by that?
I mean that sports just being sports. Like, I think that for me, it's probably more of a separation of where I would rather watch a sport or watch a game and not have to...
all the stuff around it.
Yes.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
And I think because it brings a different element to it, it makes it heavy. It's political. I think it takes away from what actually the sport is, which goes back to what I said in the beginning, for the love of the game and the purity of a sport. I think that that's really gotten taken away, where you're mixing things now where sports are, it's not just sports anymore. And And I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, me personally, I would rather not have it have gone this way, but I think it's a natural evolution of things. I think that it's just sort of how the world is, because the world now is more diverse. Things are more mixed. It's not as compartmentalized and segregated in terms of these things. So I think that it fits in how the world has also evolved.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're talking about the nature of coverage itself, right? That the nature of sports coverage has changed from box scores and highlights to this conversation around contracts and agents and how people are doing the business of sports and debating all those things and who's getting fired and traded and all that kind of stuff. And that broader conversation of sports media has changed the way that we do this coverage.
So I think that's all part of sports. But what I think now it has evolved into is that it's become more political. Instead of sports just being sports, I mean, it's now we have to take a stand. I mean, it has to have some bigger meaning. And I think that what I miss most is watching a sport or a game just for that sport or game.
Okay, I got it. I got to say something. All right, so
Yeah, me too.
I don't know if sports has ever not been political. I mean, when you look back at Tommy Carlos back in 1968, when you look at Muhammad Ali, when you look at Jim Brown, I mean, politics and sports has always been intertwined. The only difference is that now people are talking about it, right? They're commenting on it in ESPN. So, go ahead. Go.
Well, I mean, I was just immediately, Billie Jean King is playing her Battle of the Sexes on purpose, right? I mean, that was politicizing something. But I was thinking about, and I should have said at the beginning, as you said, you just are rooting for LeBron James. I mean, I'm
we
rooting
all should root for LeBron James.
Yes. No, I would put myself in that camp. But if I was picking sort of mine, I would say, it's the Williams sisters. And I think about, as you were talking, I was thinking about how the really, really good writing, I think, that has come out, particularly since Serena Williams came back after having a baby and is playing, that, she is a black woman body on a tennis court being observed by millions and millions of people. And she knows that, and she's doing that on purpose. And if that is her platform, that is also her court. That is where she plays her game. And she had to fight to get to play the game where she plays it. But when I think about the writing about whether she's wearing her Black Panther outfit or whether her skirts, or whether she's got on the tutu and how this is all being observed, I mean, I think she is beautifully politicizing her body. And also just a gorgeous tennis player, right, as she's doing it. And I think that, she's setting things on fire on purpose. She's doing it and watching sports writers, then set themselves on fire, writing about what she's doing. And when we get to this narrative of she ruined tennis, tennis isn't just tennis anymore, because tennis is now about what Serena Williams is wearing. I find myself coming away and going, yeah, tennis is lots better than it used to be. It's not only lots better because the game is lots better, certainly in women's tennis is lots better, but it's just more interesting. Like, I would rather have the big conversation about the fact that I am watching someone's body move through space, and people are filling the stands to watch a woman's body move through space and hit a little ball back and forth. And what that does to empower women and make us think about women and think about women's bodies and in space and how we observe them and how we monetize them. I think those are really, really important conversations, and I'm glad to be living in the middle of them.
And I think that what we're responding to really is the way that social media democratizes our expressions. And so now a tweet from Joe Blow in Bloomington, Indiana, can go viral and now causes everyone to have to respond to it. And so I don't think we'll ever get back to the purity of sports the way that it was. But I think that what we're trying to grapple with is the way that now athletes are able to kind of go on social media and say what they want to say. They're able to go on social media, and LeBron James is able to wear a hoodie, and they're able to kneel. They're able to do all these kinds of things. And so now athletes are not in these spaces where we only see them when they're performing. We now see them when they're living their lives. And when you see a person when they're living their lives, you begin to see what they think politically. And so I just don't think that we can ever get back to where we used to be. And I'm happy that we can't go back there.
Because if we didn't have these conversations, there wouldn't be people of color playing sports at all. Right?
Absolutely.
I mean,
Absolutely.
Without a push, without a movement, teams wouldn't have been segregated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And conversations create opportunity. And so we need to continue the discussions. We need to see athletes as you said, as people, and not just someone in a uniform getting paid.
And hovering over all of this, if we're just going to be honest, it's just the orange elephant in the room, who's Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump is a person that he invokes response, right? Just him being who he is evokes response. And so there are going to be athletes who are going to respond to this dude. And that's perfectly fine with me.
I think social media has, like you said earlier, has caused that. It's easier for people to make comments behind a phone.
Absolutely.
Because I can't come get in your face from the phone, right? Mm-hmm. So it's giving people more courage to talk when maybe they should just be quiet.
Yeah, I think that that's sort of where we're headed with this discussion of media, in the sense that there are these media personalities, whether it's Donald Trump or whether it's any number of other, people who are out there being provocateurs in the media, and that they choose sports for a reason, right? That there is this visibility and this platform existing in sports. And I was hoping we could talk a little bit more about this question of platform, because it's come up a couple of times about how athletes have this built-in platform, and obviously, it's. I think the other elephant in the room is the question of kneeling, and the question of people like Colin Kaepernick and Eric Reed and the way in which they have used their platform. And I'm wondering about the difference between athletes who use the platform that is part of their natural disposition as athletes, and as you mentioned earlier, Director Terrain, the idea that an athlete is always going to have a camera focused on them already, versus there was a time, it feels to me, as though when athletes took their identity and brought it to another platform. So we think about Muhammad Ali going to anti-war rallies, and that's a difference, right? That's a difference that we see now between an athlete going to a protest and an athlete creating a protest on their own platform. And I'm wondering if we could explore a little bit about what that distinction means. What does it mean to a fan? The kind of thing that Ms. Shan is expressing, that as a fan, as an observer, it feels like an imposition to have the protest brought to the platform of the sport, rather than the athlete taking their own identity and lending it to someone else's protest. I'm wondering if we could explore that a little bit. Maybe Professor Ware, if you could talk about, you mentioned John Carlos and Tommy Smith in '68, and LeBron or WNBA players making a protest on the court. What's the difference between that and going yourself to a protest and bringing visibility to another platform?
I mean, I think that Colin Kaepernick kneeling is in the Tommy Smith kind of tradition of doing something on an athletic stage that really draws attention. Now, the thing about Kaepernick, and I mean, we all know this, but the thing about Kaepernick is that he was just sitting one day, no one was paying attention to him, and then it became this huge thing, right? But with Tommy Smith and John Carlos, like they're, 1968, standing up in front of, the entire world. I mean, that's a completely different thing. Colin Kaepernick kind of back-weighed his way into this, and I think he did a pretty good job of it. But they're in that tradition. Now, you do have a history of athletes who just went to protest, who silently supported protest, and I think that's a means to kind of achieve social change as well. So I think both of them are needed, right? I don't think any one of them is necessarily better. I mean, if a person wants to put themselves out there, they can do that. If they want to just kind of donate money and be quiet, they can do that as well. But both of these things are necessary in order to kind of create social change.
I would agree. I think it really does depend on the personality of that athlete. Mm-hmm. Do they want the media attention because they believe it will move their actions faster, or do they want to take the time and be behind the scenes and not be the forefront of it, but want to support it? But like Lauren said, I think both are needed, both happen, right? But it's that individual's decision. And it's just like on a college campus with student athletes. And some don't want the attention and do other things to create social move, right?
Mm-hmm. You know, maybe because I lived in Washington, D.C. for many, many, many years and have been to many football games for the Washington football team. And
I love how you call them the Washington football team. Very clever. I like that.
Because it was political when they named the team.
It was.
Right? It's not that the people protesting are creating the politics, right? Every time you're at a sporting event and you stand up, you've engaged in a political action. When you stand up, you just didn't realize. I mean, all of us didn't, right? We just did it because somebody said this is what's polite to do, and you stand up and you don't chug your beer in that moment, or you tell people to shh, we're singing we're doing this now. But you see so much of military spectacle when you're in Washington. At halftime or at the beginning, the flyovers are always there because Andrews Air Force Base is right there. The times that I've been there when Marine One has flown over and the president's been coming back to land, just as the proximity of where the football stadium is. But it's not that I didn't used to think about that as being me engaged in having a political voice and using it every time I was there, just there, and participating. And it's not until we see people making us realize that we can begin to think about our own participation in the politics of sports. I mean, I assume that every basketball game starts with the national anthem, right? I mean, it is right? Can we just play Whitney Houston now for a minute? It's not that I don't want to hear somebody sing the national anthem. That's fine, especially somebody really good at it. But when I stand up for it, I am demonstrating something. And if I sit down now, well, I'm demonstrating something else as an individual. And, I'm grateful to the people who made me think about it as a political act instead of as robotics that I'm engaged in.
Well, and I think that raises the interesting point of the spectacle itself and how the spectacle is moderated and controlled in that sense. And there was a time, of course, in the early 20th century, we only sang the national anthem at the World Series. We didn't sing it before every single sporting event in the entire country at all times.
Home of the Braves.
Yeah, exactly. And every place has their own way. I mean, in Baltimore, they scream out the O, and in Atlanta, they scream out the Braves part. And, everybody has their way of manipulating the national anthem to their own fandom ends. But more broadly, this question of patriotism and war and peace and that kind of thing. I mean, we've seen an evolution of that with athletes from World War II, where baseball players were just like Jimmy Stewart or whoever, and they were newsreel footage of them, Ted Williams going off to war to fight. To the 60s and 70s, where it was a little bit more of a protest movement involved in sports, and then up through now, post 9/11, where we've got more flyovers, as you mentioned, Professor Dillard, and even the Pat Tillman saga and things like that. The relationship of athletes to patriotism, to war and peace. Is there some way in which we're seeing less of that now? That while we have these social movements involved in sports that we've all discussed, race and gender and things like that, we're not necessarily seeing as much visible protest from athletes or visible support from athletes in terms of actually saying, I support this war, I'm against this war, or anything like that. Yeah, I'm wondering if visibility-wise, what are we...
I mean, I think that right now, I think that it depends upon the era that you're in. I mean, so World War II, there was a big war that was happening, and so you had baseball players who were supporting the war. The Vietnam War was very divisive, and so you had athletes who were very vocal about being on the other side of that. So you had Muhammad Ali, you had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, you had all these athletes who were very so I think it depends upon the time that you're in, right? So if like right now, like we're fighting, but we're not fighting. Like it's a weird thing that's happening right now. Like we're fighting this war, and it's a war, and people are dying, but we're kind of not talking about it. And so I don't think the athletes just have that much awareness. I mean, they're human beings who have to like go to practice and they have to eat dinner and they have to raise their kids. And so unless it's kind of being put in the forefront of what they're thinking about, then they're not going to be talking about it. Now, if we were to enter into a war, I think that you would see athletes who kind of say something about what's going on militarily.
Yeah, I mean, and that's sort of what I'm driving at, is that we're seeing these certain ways in which athletes are driving the conversation, are the ones who are setting the table for these conversations. As you say, even when they back into it, the way Colin Kaepernick maybe did. Yeah. What is it about this particular type of issue that is a tail wagging the dog, or the other way around, about the issue of war and peace, about the issue of militarism and things like that? I mean, why is that the issue that is dependent on your era versus some of these other things that we've talked about? Or is it? Or is there any difference?
Can it just be it may just be that it's not personal. I mean, when I think about watching Allie Reisman, or I think about Colin Kaepernick, they're really telling a story about, as a person, this is the body I live in and the world that I live in, and here are things that have happened to me. Mm-hmm. And so when I hear a black man who's an athlete say, this is the experience I had with the police, and I'm a rich athlete, I am, because I'm taller and fitter than you are, right? Like, you're not going to mistake me for someone, just some regular black guy that you're going to approach as a police officer. Even me, right? Or Allie Reisman, even me. If this can happen to even me, what's happening at all the other gyms mm-hmm. in the United States? That's a very good point. And so I think and then you get a hashtag. Right, so then you get a Black Lives Matter hashtag or a Me Too hashtag that goes with it. And when we think about war now, it feels very diffuse, right? It's not that there isn't a lot of it and a lot of terrible things and children dying on front pages of newspapers, but it feels diffuse in a way that when I think about war historically, which is really the only way I can think about it, any of us can think about it, we see it as something that was very concentrated, as if there was a protest against the Vietnam War every day on a college campus for however many years. And we certainly don't see that today on this campus about any defined war and that protest.
Good answer.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to open it up a little bit for our last few minutes to some questions from the audience. We have a few folks with microphones walking around, and we may or may not have some prizes a la the stadiums, and some T-shirts we can toss if anybody wants to ask some questions. We have one over here.
T-shirt. I do too.
She has the mic.
This has been really interesting to hear, and I'm an older person, and I remember back in the 60s, everybody played baseball. All the guys, during the summer, from the crack of dawn till nighttime, we went out and played baseball in the neighborhood. And I remember seeing a headline in the Indianapolis Star sports section. It said, Willie Mays signs contract for $100,000. And I couldn't believe, I'm like 10 or 11, couldn't believe that a guy could make that kind of money to play something that we all love to do. And so I always, as an older person, before I came here today, I thought, back when I was a kid, sports was pure. And I'm thinking of the Boston Celtics, Bill Russell, John Havlicek, Casey Jones, Sam Jones. They all played for the same team their whole careers. Yeah. And, pretty good basketball players said talent wins games, but teamwork wins championships. That doesn't exist anymore. We don't have this thing called team. Remember this movie, Hoosiers? And the guy shooting up the shot, he violated the coach's rule, passed 4 times. He kept shooting. To heck with the coach. The coach takes him out of the game. There's only 4 players on the team now. And the referee says, well, you got to get this kid back in the game. He says, my team's on the court. My team's on the court. Coaches taught people lessons, character stuff. And so I was interested to know, what do you think about this idea of team and how that's changed? Because you talk about Serena Williams, well, she's an individual athlete. And so this conversation could be divided between individuals and teams as well. So that was my question.
We'd have to, I mean, I can't go long on it, but we'd have to start with Curt Flood, right? We'd have to start with free agency. We'd have to start with the idea that I play for you, but my loyalty to you comes at a price, and you need to pay me the way you pay other people to do it. And others may be able to really talk about it. I've only heard a couple of people do job talks about it over the years as a law professor, and it's one of the most interesting stories to me about this breakdown of we're a team, we're in this together, and that means you have to make less money than I make, but that you still are an individual who has a talent to offer to others for the highest dollar. I think it's a real tension. I think there's a lot of race in it.
Gosh, I'm trying to decide, do I want to weigh into this? I mean, there's this tenuous balance between the self-interest of a player who wants to, like, let's say, win a championship, and a player who wants to make money. And oftentimes, you go in the direction of wanting to make money because that is what's going to sustain your family for the long term. When you get to a certain level, so like a KD, when KD left the Thunder, which, by the way, I'm not a Thunder fan. I don't care what you're saying. But when KD left the Thunder, he left because he wanted to win a championship, and he took a little bit less money to do it. So I do think that there are people who are very much centered on team and teamwork and things, and then there are people who are very centered on themselves. But I do think that once a team comes together, they do work on that teamwork. I mean, they do try to create this team identity, but there's always been money in the background. There's always been people who have been looking out for themselves. I mean, it's always been there. So, I mean, this mythological past of we once, were teams and we're not teams anymore, I don't know if that ever existed. I just don't know if it did. Because once money gets involved in sports, people start becoming self-interested because that's just the nature of who we are. So, I don't know. I'm going to leave it there.
I would love to ask Lawrence, though, but based on his question or his examples, the Boston Celtics, the Lakers, those teams that never changed and won championships after championships.
It was a different era.
What was that?
It was a completely different era. Now that's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen because people don't play that way anymore.
I will say, with LeBron's first decision,
It changed everything.
well, actually, when I thought about it, of course, I was very upset because in terms of love of the game, I wanted him to stay in Cleveland, but they all took less. So, he took less, Bosch took less. They all took less to play together because they wanted to win a championship. And that was one thing that I could respect. But I will say, in terms of a team, I think that concept is less prevalent these days. I think a lot of it comes from the fact that you, as a youth, you start looking at sports as your job. And so, when you go into a college program for football or basketball and you start acting like a pro, that's supposed to be a plus because that means that you are treating this sport as your job and you go into it every day working at it and treating it like a job. And so, now every kid has a trainer. They all, especially quarterbacks, they all have their own quarterback coaches. But you have trainers all over. You have 7-on-7 for football. And it's just so much of that, I think, it just at a younger and younger age where kids are looking at sports as their job, as their profession. And they have to treat it like that because of how competitive it is now. If you don't treat it like that, you will get left behind. And so I think it's just an evolution, and it's, I would say, probably a natural evolution based on the fact that, it's natural selection. It's just so much more competitive. The game is faster. You have to start at a younger and younger age, and you have to treat this sport like a job.
Of course, it also looks like the rest of corporate America, right? My father spent 40 years working for the same company and getting a watch every 5 years for doing it. Nobody does that anymore. And he probably passed up a lot of opportunity to make more money to do different things because he had company loyalty and he started loading trucks there. right? And I can see that same mentality in sports being dominant, but I do think that, that maybe those teams haven't supported all the players equally in the ways and built the family and the way that it used to, because it became a moneymaker. And the top people who aren't out there playing are making the most money.
And just to put in a plug for one of our later panels as well, we're going to talk in the Cost of Kneeling panel a little bit about labor implications and the changes that have wrought since free agency has come in and things like that. So I hope to explore this question a little bit later. Do we have another? Okay. Michael?
Hi. I split my time as a kid between Ireland and South Bend. So my first love was European soccer, and my second love was Lou Holtz and the gold helmets glinting in the sun. The panelists started off by talking about how much they think sports have changed since they were growing up. And I think that's true. The NBA last night doesn't look anything like it did when it was Reggie getting pushed around in the finals by the Lakers, and the Super Bowl a couple weeks ago doesn't look like, when it was Kurt Warner against the Titans. They really are very different, and it doesn't take a lot to see that. But when you look at European soccer, today versus 25 years ago, the changes are not nearly as major. They're not nearly as significant and as obvious. The stadiums are a little nicer, the shorts are less baggy, but most of it is intact. And I wonder if the panelists could comment about to what extent, if any, they think that might be impacted by or related to the legal nature of American teams. And what I mean by that is Manchester United is always going to be in the red half of Manchester. It's an inexorable part of the community. It's not going anywhere. But because American teams professional sports teams are not independent clubs, they're franchises. To the extent that they are integrated into a community, it's always with the caveat that, at the drop of a hat, they could leave and they could be gone tomorrow. And there's no football team in St. Louis anymore, and there's no basketball team in Seattle. And I'm just curious as to whether the panelists have any thoughts about whether that accounts or plays some role in accounting for the disparity between how much American sports seems to have changed in the last 25 years versus, at the very least, European soccer.
I guess with European soccer, I just look at that as more structured because, it's sort of where you have Real or Barca, they have their farm systems and their developmental programs. They're getting kids in there from when they're younger. And this has been the system, forever. And it's sort of, like with China, where it's a nationalized sports program, that's what they do. They pick kids when they're 5, they put them in that program, and they basically live that. And that's how it's been done for, the last 40 years. Whereas our system is not as structured, and I think because it's not as structured, it gives it room to evolve and to move and to sort of, we're a capitalistic society. And so I think that in the U.S., because it's so much about freedom and capitalism, that it gives, I think that there's less structure, and because of that, it has evolved and changed a lot. Whereas in a more structured program with European soccer and, like with Chinese sports, when I look at that, I think that has less change.
Good answer.
And I will say just my own 2 cents on that is there are also differences among those places, and the way we see community ownership of teams, for example, in Germany. Anybody who knows me knows that I can talk about soccer all day. But where we have community ownership of teams, like we do in Germany, where there are some teams that are community owned and some teams that are corporate owned. So you've got. It's right in the name, right? Bayern Munich. It's Bayer Leverkusen, right? They're run by the Bayer company. Julian here is sitting with a Red Bull shirt on, and Red Bull has had to change the names of some of their teams in Germany to keep from advertising themselves because there are community-owned teams. And we see that in the United States. There was a mention earlier of the Green Bay Packers, right? There's a community ownership structure in the Green Bay Packers that changes the nature, I would say, of that team to its community, keeps that team in such a small environment that we really do see. But I agree completely with what you said, Ms. Shan, that there is this structured, hierarchy of the way teams operate in those places, and so small teams grow in certain ways. A team like Manchester United, which starts as Newton Heath, 120 years ago, and sort of grows into what it is now as Manchester becomes an industrial center. That is a different growth model that we don't see in the United States, and I think it does make a difference. So I think we have time for one more question. We've got one of our visitors here might have a question. Ben here in the middle.
Yes. To put a point to Colin Kaepernick and the issue, it's August of 2018. A young associate of this person's law firm and I are fishing in Baja, Mexico. Now, you wouldn't think there'd be, how would that happen? We're fishing in Baja. He's there so the old man doesn't fall in the ground.
It's a great short story.
And we're sitting at a table after a fishing tournament on the East Cape. Spencer and I are talking, and another gentleman, I'll stereotype him, but that's how you picture it. Kind of a redneck from California with a baseball cap. Sits down right next to Spencer. Spencer's facing me. We're talking about Colin Kaepernick. Huh? Colin. And this guy says, well, I think we ought to lynch him. Now,
Wow.
Spencer turns around. He's
Oh, my
graduating
goodness.
Up the school, up the road, the night law school. Spencer turns around. Oh,
The redneck said this? The redneck said this?
pardon?
The redneck said this?
No, yes, the redneck says that.
Okay.
Our conversation.
Okay.
Colin.
All right.
When Spencer, he's sitting right next to Spencer. Now this 2018, lynched. Spencer looks at him. Oops. No, it's not tan. He's an African American. And Spencer's comment was, well, I disagree with that. Did you ever kneel in church? And then he kind of got up and left. It was 2018. That was a strong.
I'm not
I don't think
surprised.
he was drunk. But mind to make that statement, in my view, in 2018, to say he ought to be lynched is about as pejorative of a comment for a black male that you could possibly make. The only thing, the analogy would be the C word to a woman.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe that would happen, but it did. Maybe he was from Idaho or Utah and not from California, or if he was, he's from Orange County.
If I might piggyback on that really quickly, I'm curious what you guys think about I don't know if we can label it as Colin's, demonstration. Was it successful or not? Is it successful? Because I think the easy answer is we're talking about it, so it's successful, right? Mm-hmm. But in some ways, I think it's been red meat for the two sides, right? Because the people who talk about it, I think generally are thoughtful people that want to have these conversations. I go to every Indianapolis Colts football game, and I can tell you that if I kneel during the national anthem, there are people that are sitting around me that I high-five during the games that would want to punch me in the face. Mm-hmm. But they don't think two things about it if I decide that's the moment I'm going to run and get a beer. And there's tons of people out in the concourse shoving food in their face, like yammering and all these kinds of things. They don't recognize the hypocrisy. And so sometimes I'm conflicted about was this a good thing or a bad thing, because, as you said, President Trump kind of hijacked it and said this is unpatriotic, right? And so it got immediately away from what the conversation was supposed to be. And now it turned into this thing about patriotism, which was just mind-boggling. And so I wonder, I think overall, I'm very happy that it's happened because I think it's a conversation. But I think sometimes I wonder, are both sides just talking their own talking points to their own people and saying, these people over here saying, we're saying this is a great, sort of demonstration of, to protest in a very visible way police brutality, and they're saying, these guys are unpatriotic, and shouldn't they just be drug out in the street and kick the crap out of them,
I think only Colin Kaepernick from himself can say whether this was a benefit or whatever, but for us, I think what it showed us is that we can't have civil discourse, right? We cannot have different sides and talk it through and leave away with the conversation that I may not agree with you, but I still respect you as a person, right? And I think it helped that we are talking about it, right? But we're still not separating the issue, of why he actually did it. It wasn't about patriotism. It wasn't about the flag. It was for a whole different cause, right? But at the same time, people put flags on their T-shirts. They put them on, swing them from the car. So it's so, we're just not there where we could just have the conversations. We started the dialogue, but we still can't do it in a civil manner and still be able to walk away respecting one another's opinions and moving on.
I mean, just to really quickly, financially, it was incredibly financially successful for him. I mean, he got the Nike contract, so financially for him it was very successful. As far as having any kind of impact on the number of African Americans that have been killed by the police, it has not been successful at all.
I will say though, what he's done in the community may have helped.
That's been successful.
Yeah.
But
that they don't talk about, right?
Well, I think it is a voice in the chorus about violence against particularly black people at the hands of police officers in the United States. So I do think he has had a voice in that, and I think his voice is joining a chorus. And I think about things like, I talked to, yes, I mean, I can't get to that quite yet. We have of course, it can't change that quickly. Yeah. It's a big, terrible ship that's been sailing in one direction for a long time. But I think about things like how to use privilege and participate in protest without getting punched by the guy sitting next to you. And one way is to get up and go get a beer, right? The other is to wear your Black Lives Matter shirt while you stay sitting as a white guy. And I think that is a way.
You'll get punched.
He can take it. But I do think there are ways to participate and to try to regain the conversation that I think Kaepernick's trying to have away from the others who've tried to take it in a different direction. We just wander around thinking about what our privilege is and how to exercise it in safe ways, but helpful ways. I think there are ways short of being an NFL quarterback who doesn't have a contract because he's been kneeling. I think there are other ways.
Well, and I do, again, want to put in a plug for one of our later panels because we are going to talk a little bit more about the general impact of those kinds of decisions. And I know I said we were going to wrap up, but I am very much enjoying this conversation, and I would like to at least get another of our journal members to get a question in. And so I think we have one here.
Yeah, my question is, I guess, it's related in some ways to this, but a lot of times I think the majority of people look at sports and they want to see some sort of unifying, we talk about, teams in relationship to community. This idea of gives you an identity of a group of people, something you can root for. And I know that's tougher with individual athletes in that sense because there isn't necessarily a place. But I wonder if some of the backlash we talk about when it comes to like the kneeling is not just the protest itself, but this idea of, and it's actually related to the sports being sports, whether it's inserting divisive topics into what people think should be a unifying event, and whether that juxtaposition leads to the actual controversy, not necessarily the protest qua protest. Does that make sense?
So the stick to sports mentality?
In relation to unifying versus divisive, obviously there's always been politics in sports. You go back to, Jackie Robinson, even before that. But this idea of, especially with how politicized, you guys all talked about it, how we feel like it's harder to have civil discourse. Everything is so politicized, whether taking something that many people think shouldn't be political and then putting something that's very divisive with the way our current culture is, whether that
may account for the backlash more than just the things being protested for?
Can I put it in this perspective?
Please.
Think about if you went to work and felt like you couldn't have a conversation because it was going to divide this, divide your team, divide your, or just feeling like you just had to be quiet because you were at work.
Yeah, every day.
You couldn't be yourself. You couldn't be authentic. You couldn't express your beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
I mean, it's reality for a lot of people. Self-censorship is a thing that happens everywhere.
I do get this myth, though, of the teaminess of some sports. And, I mean, there's this great line in Eastbound and Down when Danny McBride
The song or the TV show?
It says, "Oh, I'm a triathlete," and he says, "Oh, I'm not trying to be the best at exercise," right? That this idea that individual sports, like marathoners, you're like, what? You're just exercising. Like, you're not playing a sport right now. That's not sports, and that sports is Hoosiers, right? Sports is this moment in the locker room. We're all in this together. When some people have to sacrifice so other people can shine, and the offensive lineman isn't the glory player to a lot of people, but if he wasn't there, the quarterback would be. And this idea that we're all in this together, and that the moment that we're individuals, do you lose something of that mythical fabric? I don't know, because I didn't play those kind of sports. But I get that that's the narrative. Right, that the narrative is we got to all be in this together, and if we're bickering about kneeling or not kneeling, then that makes me worry that you're not going to block well enough for me while I'm getting ready to throw a football. And that narrative, I don't know if it's true or not, but I get that it is the argument that is made about why not dividing in that workplace.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I just don't know if it's real or not.
I think that people have this assumption that sports was historically this unifying thing, and I don't think it ever really was. I mean, I'm from the school of thought, coming from the black perspective. Now, Michael Jordan being to the side, because Michael Jordan's a weird person. But putting him to the side,
Not wrong.
I come from the school of thought where black athletes have always been divisive in sports locker rooms. And anytime you brought anything that was from outside into the locker room, you brought with it this divisive nature. So I think that, I don't know, people want there to be this unifying thing about sports. I don't think it's ever really been there. I think that now we're going to be talking about the divisive nature of sports for now until eternity.
So I guess my question is...
Well, I was going to say, I think the Olympics and the World Cup, these kinds of events, they unify individuals and individual athletes. And so I do disagree that sports is not... Well, I guess with your assumption that it's always been divisive. I don't believe that. I think in these global sporting events, I mean, you have an entire country coming together, going toward one goal.
But when you have a diverse group of people in a room, it's always going to be something distracting. You're going to have an experience that I don't have. Yeah. You're going to be able to talk about an experience that I can't. I'll be able to talk about an experience you can't. You want to ask me about my hair. I want to ask you about your eyes. How do I do that? I mean, there's difference because we're all different.
Now, I will say that the spirit of the Olympics is to bring us all together, but the reality of the Olympics is that there's going to be some divisive nature going on. But
sportive nationalism is alive and well, but I don't know if everybody buys it. I think it's there. It's certainly part of what we're being sold.
And I think it's and that's exactly the point I was going to raise, that is this a question back to this idea of the democratization of media, that there was a time when sports could seem more uniform, team-oriented, because the narrative was controlled by the teams and the leagues and the capital behind it, versus the individual players who are now somehow their views are expressed more publicly, the way that all of our views are more laid bare nowadays. Is that really what we're talking about here?
When the athletes are being silenced, it looks like everyone's on the same board. When athletes are able to articulate what they feel and what they think, you begin to see divisions. It's that simple.
Yeah. I think one of our panelists who's in the room had her hand up as well. One of our later panelists, I'd love to...
Is this working?
It just takes a second. Yeah.
I was going to kind of respond to your point. I think what's attractive for athletes to bring kind of these controversies and more so questions to the forefront is because if you look at people like LeBron James, when he wore a hoodie, he was told to, quote, shut up and dribble. So I think when you look at the rebuttal to these protests, we can see that society attributes value in these athletes based on their athleticism. So I think naturally it would be most pragmatic to bring the controversy to where society finds value in you, which is where you'll actually be seen. So for Colin Kaepernick, you know, he has Know Your Rights camp and he does all of this activism, but it's not publicized, it's not talked about on Fox News or any major, you know, public network. What's talked about is what he does on a football field. And so I also think that it's important that we look at how different viewpoints are portrayed. So for instance, when Tim Tebow kneeled in support of pro-rights movement, no one said anything. It was very silent and fell on deaf ears. And the people who did talk about it, they largely celebrated it. And I believe they did so because they agreed with it. So when you look at how these different things are met in the public eye, you have to say, well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So perhaps it's not necessarily that we have an issue with the protest, but that we have an issue with the thing that is being protested. We have an issue with you talking about police brutality and race and things when I, quote unquote, just want to watch football. So.
And I had totally forgotten about the 3-6 under his eyes, right? I mean, even, I was thinking about tattoos and how people individualize once they're put in a uniform. So how you still become an individual as you're in it. But I'd totally forgotten about the John 3. I mean, right? Oh, God.
Well, and I guess there's a really, there was a tidbit in what you said there about the ways in which a lot of these athletes are engaged with causes that don't get publicized at all. You know, LeBron James is a great example of someone who does a whole lot of charitable work that doesn't get publicized. And I'm wondering if there are, this ties into a conversation we had here on Martin Luther King Day about the difference between modern protest movements and protest movements of an era. And we sort of see the video of the I Have a Dream speech and think that this was, you know, some unifying event, when actually there were huge divisions within the coalition that put that event together. And there were people, especially younger people at that event, who were told, no, you can't do that, some of whom are in Congress now. And we're told, no, you can't do that. You can't raise the issue you want to raise because it's too radical, and we're trying to have this unifying event. And I'm wondering if there are ways in which, you know, we're talking about protest movements as though it's a unitary thing, rather than we just don't have a lot of exposure to what constitutes protest and political activism anymore. Does that make sense in the context of athletes as well as the broader society?
I mean, I just always think that there's pragmatism, right? Pragmatic, progressive ideas, and then there's radical thinking and radical protest. I mean, when you watch RBG, that documentary, a lot of people come away sort of going, oh my gosh, she's such a whatever, and I come away sort of going, oh my God, she is such a pragmatic incrementalist. It's gorgeous to watch. Nothing else probably would have worked at the time. But if you're a radical thinker, you don't come away from that going, I mean, there's my champion. I mean, you just don't come away from it feeling that way. What you see is somebody very carefully building a case and a cause for something else. And you know, it seems to me that someone like Colin Kaepernick is not doing that, right? I mean, he's doing a radical, individual, this is what I think and do, and if other people follow me, then we might become a movement, but if they don't, then I've just been a radical lightning rod into what was a block of silence about police violence, you know, from NFL players, I guess. It feels like two very different approaches to me to how to change things. That's the lawyer in me. Sorry.
If there are any other last words from the panel, I'd love to hear them. But otherwise, I'd ask that everybody join in giving them a round of applause for a great discussion today. We are going to have some lunch downstairs in the student lounge. I believe there are some of our journal members who are going to help out with guiding everyone to where we're going. And then some of our panelists, we're headed upstairs.
It was really nice to meet you. It really was nice to meet you.
Thank you all. I hope to see you around the rest of the day.
Thank you. That's awesome. Nice to meet you.
So you are a Notre Dame. Are you a huge Notre Dame football fan?
Am I huge?